for being willing to have this conversation today.
I do like.
Yes. So I thought we would start with kind of revisiting what's happened in the past year. We had this, we started a conversation like this last year, right after George Floyd was killed. And in the last year, we've seen a lot that's happened. In the aftermath of Floyd's death, we saw national protests all over the world, and especially in the country, of people who said enough. But then at the same time, what we also saw this year was this rise in anti-Asian violence. We saw an insurrection on our Capitol that had very overt racist language and signs. So how are you processing everything that's kind of happened in this past year? Do you think that we are better off or worse than we were a year ago?
I think we are better off in some ways, and I think we are worse off in some ways. So I don't know which one I want to talk about first, but I think that that we are better off in that I think that there is a much broader understanding across our nation and perhaps in other places as well as to how deep the racism is in our country, and also the kinds of things that people have been experiencing all of these years that a lot of people, it just wasn't a part of their awareness. And so there is a lot of shock. So one of the things that was really different, even though in the civil rights movement there were people who were not African American who were supportive and even died in that effort, there were times in which I looked at on the TV at the people who were protesting, and there were more people who were not Black, African American, or didn't appear to be involved sometimes than there were of African Americans, and that was very, very encouraging. And to hear the kinds of conversations that people are having, even I'm having with people being in a congregation that's predominantly white, that give an indication that people are in a new place of awareness. And so that's a good thing. Where I think we're worse off is that the division in the country is so, not only so noticeable and prominent, but is so dangerous. And we saw that, you know, particularly in both the march in December that a lot of people don't talk about very much, but because I live in Washington, you know, I have a great awareness of both. And then of course the incident that happened at the United States Capitol. The other good thing that has happened, that I say we're in a better place, is we've had a change in leadership in our country. And that's and we're better off because of that across the board. So what do you think? What do you think? How are you processing all of this?
I mean, I was recalling when we had this conversation a year ago, we both kind of ended on this note of hope, because there seemed to be a heightened awareness, kind of a collective consciousness, and the diversity of people who seemed to care that there were Asian Americans were engaged, white Americans were engaged, Latinos and Native folks. It wasn't just a one group that was engaged, and that was really encouraging to see. And I do hope, and I have still some hope, that this heightened awareness will lead to continued change and continued growth. Now, what I've also seen is, I think maybe in response to that heightened awareness, is kind of almost a backlash. And we saw that most evidently with the insurrection on our Capitol. And what I noticed about that racism, there was something hidden about it. It was very overt and very obvious, and that was kind of the point, like very graphic imagery and signage. Like there was no trying to hide what it was. There was a noose on our Capitol. And that
wasn't subtle at all.
no subtlety. And that was terrifying to see that so just so brazen, the racism that came out of that. And of course, it's hard not to be frustrated a year later that just this week we've seen some of the exact same situations, that we've seen another black man killed by a police officer. And I know the circumstances around that were different, but it's hard to ignore that it's happening in the same city of Minneapolis. It's really hard not to be frustrated and discouraged by that as well.
Yeah.
So I'm with you that there are some aspects of hope that I see. I'm encouraged that there is a heightened awareness that we can have conversations like this, and people are starting to have them. But of course, we can't have this conversation without naming the frustration that also comes with that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not an either or kind of
Yeah.
situation, and it is not, and it is not a time for us to become complacent.
Right. Right.
About what is happening
Right.
in our lives.
Yeah.
The one thing that I think that is true is that African Americans, and I'm beginning to understand it's true in the Asian community as well.
Mm-hmm.
They've been knowing what's been going on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas other people are finding this as, oh my goodness, I didn't know that was happening. But that kind of living in fear,
Mm-hmm.
wondering, what's going to happen, wondering if our children are safe,
Yeah.
and that's been just the undertone of life.
Right. Like, heightened awareness doesn't mean that racism just happened in the last year. It's been
Right.
happening for a long time.
Yeah,
It's
that's
just
right.
that it's finally becoming verbalized and recognized.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and so we've been talking about, yes, racism, people say, everything's fine. No, everything is not fine, because we can identify the subtle kinds of things that were going on, because you were talking about how open everything was,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been there in very subtle ways
Mm-hmm.
as
Right.
well.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's true. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I want to transition to kind of deepening our understanding of what we've seen over the past year. So over the past year, we've seen also this rise in anti-Asian violence.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that this is linked to other racially motivated violence we've seen over the last year?
Yes.
How is anti-Asian racism same or different from anti-Black racism, or the racism that other communities of color face?
Well, I think that all of the kinds of isms that we are dealing with across humanity are based, have at their basis some sexism.
Mm.
So in that way, they're all connected,
Hmm.
because this sexism is churning,
Hmm.
and it manifests in different ways.
Yeah.
So I think that I had tried to raise the issue about anti-Asian racism as soon as our former president
Mm.
began to call it the Chinese flu and the Kung Fu
Mhm.
flu. And I
Mhm.
said to someone, he needs to stop doing that, because it is, it's another kind of dog whistle,
Mm. Mhm.
that is focused on Asian Americans.
Sure. Yeah.
And people from the Pacific Islands and
Mhm.
all that
Yeah.
whole group of people. And we had seen his attack, for example, on people who are from the Middle East
Mhm.
already. And so now, added on to this with these Asian kind of things. And the person couldn't see it. They said, oh, well, it did come from China. I said, that's not an excuse to be
Right.
saying things like this.
Right.
Okay, and so I saw that there was this connection, because words not only express meaning, words create meaning as well. You know, we have to be careful about the kind of language that we are using.
Yeah.
And but I had an awareness of Asian, anti-Asian experience in the United States when I went to college. I was one of 5 black students who integrated George Washington University in 1958. And I was trying to remember the other day who were the other women, but there were about 5 of us that kind of hung together, and we were not all African American.
Okay.
One of them told me a story about her family, and her family, she was white, and she told me one time about the fact that during the war, her father, who was an expert in Chinese culture and spoke Chinese, was interned because of that, even though he was a white male. And I was like, oh my goodness, I never thought of anything like that happening in that way. So there definitely is this kind of inclination, it seems, for people to decide that there has to be a hierarchy of people.
Yeah.
So somebody's got to be on the top, and somebody's got to be on the bottom. And so the people in power are the ones who, you know, are on top. They're making the rules. They're you know, working to make the culture, their culture, what they do is right. What other people do, well, that's not so good, or it's bad. Okay. And so there is this kind of what I see happening is that you've got this kind of hierarchy, and if you really look at it, you can say it has to do with color of skin. Because if blacks on the bottom, whites on the top, and then Asians who are, well, they're not brown, but they're not white, so they can be up here, you know, right underneath the white people. And then the Latinos, well, they're not white, but they're not black, and they're not quite as light, you know, as Asians, so they can be somewhere here in between. And but all of it is based on the same kind of ideas, that some people are more worthy, some people are better than, some people are deserving more than other people. And what they've done is they've decided how much you get.
It's assigning value based on skin color. Right? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that is, you know, what links them all. But how it gets expressed, and in the times and ways it gets expressed, either very subtly or very explicitly, are very different. So Asians have become the model minority, okay, and blacks have become, well, you're not quite fully human, you know, but it's the same thing operating. So, but you know more about Asian, anti-Asian.
I do,
than I do. So, you know, when did you first realize that there was this attitude, this hate, this discrimination against Asian Americans? And how do you deal with that?
Well, I totally agree with you that I think anti-Asian racism is very much connected to other racially motivated violence and racism that we've seen. I think there is a tendency to kind of pit communities of color against each other by creating this hierarchy. And what it essentially does is kind of makes people fight over for crumbs, basically, for lack of a better term. You know, and I think sometimes that racism manifests itself differently. So I think for Asian Americans, racism against Asian Americans and Asian American Pacific Islander communities is often, I think, dismissed or overlooked. So it will be things like, well, you don't have it as bad as X, Y, Z, which is exactly kind of what you're pointing to. And one of the ways is something that you talked about that I want to talk a little bit about, which is called the model minority myth. So the model minority myth is this stereotype that somehow Asians are a model minority, that we are more successful somehow than other minorities.
And smarter.
And so in itself, it's literally comparing Asian Americans versus other minority groups. And I think model minority myth is problematic in so many ways, and I want to just talk a little bit about that because I think that gets to some of the root issues. So, first, the model minority myth, just statistically, is just inaccurate. Like, the Asian American Pacific Islander community is a widely diverse community. There's 48 countries reflected in Asia. The Pacific Islander community is not the same as East Asia, is not the same as Southeast Asia, is not the same as South Asia. And even within each of those groups, there's a lot of diversity. And when you kind of lump everybody together like that and make this blanket statement, it's just not true. And what it also does is that it diminishes communities who are struggling. If you're a recent immigrant, it's a totally different experience than if you've been educated here in the US or you have a accelerated degree. It minimizes the experiences of people who really are facing struggles. But I think the most harmful part of the model minority myth is that it's used as a racial wedge. And this is exactly kind of what you were pointing to, right? So Asian Americans are lifted up as kind of an example of a minority group who overcame discrimination to succeed. And then the argument is used to then minimize the existence of racism and discrimination, to say, well, the Asian Americans did it, right? Yeah. And then I think what's happened a lot is that then Asian Americans are especially pitted against African Americans and Latinos. And so there's this direct comparison. And what it does is it pits these communities against each other. I mean, even the way it's structured, that it's called a model minority versus what's the alternative, a problem minority, right? Like that is the dichotomy that's created with a term like that. So I think the model minority myth stereotype is just a really, really harmful one. And then the other reality is that Asian American Pacific Islanders face racism. Like that is a reality. In the last year, we have seen this meteoric rise in anti-Asian violence. It's been up over 1,000%, which is an incredible number. Yeah. And again, like you said, it's not anything new, but there has been a renewed awareness about it, in part because of some of the very dangerous rhetoric that was associated with the coronavirus. I think we've all seen these terrible videos of especially Asian elderly people just unprovoked kind of just being beaten up or like literally pushed, and in some cases dying as a result. And I think that's in part because they seem like they're an easy target because they're a model minority. One of the things I was talking with a friend of mine about, in the same way that I know a lot of folks in the Black community have to talk with their children about safety and about what happens if you're pulled over by the police. What's been a very common experience for a lot of Asian Americans now is having a conversation with your parents about safety when you go out. Because so many Asian elderly people have been targeted. So I've had this conversation with my parents about, like, when you go out in public, make sure you don't go by yourself. Go with mom or dad, like stay together, stay in well-lit areas. I can't believe I'm having this conversation with my parents. And I mean, thankfully because of COVID, they're not going out very much. But that's become a reality for a lot of Asian Americans in this current season.
I've been following the news stories, and one of the things that struck me is that that very often the other communities that are experiencing racism also feel unprotected by the police. So that some of these things that are happening to Asian Americans, the people are afraid to report them because they do not feel that they are going to get any help from the authorities.
Yeah, right.
And that's just a different way of the same thing happening.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've been saying is that it manifests differently in different communities because of the way that different communities are experienced. And the other thing that I think, and I wonder what you think about this, is there are cultural dynamics, at least in some of the Asian communities. I'm not an expert on Asian culture, in which people assume that they are submissive and easily controlled, and so the way in which they are attacked is reflects that stereotype.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with you. And I want to go back to your point about police protection. You know, I worked in a domestic violence agency when I was in my 20s that worked primarily with Asian communities. And often victims of domestic violence in the Asian community were very reluctant to call the police. And it was for, you know, part of it was as an immigrant community, sometimes there were language and cultural barriers, but there was this kind of sense that they weren't going to protect you. Right? And that you kind of had to fend for yourself. And there was this kind of general, I don't know if I would say mistrust, but general concern that the police weren't there to protect you.
Right.
And so that was a big issue, was, you know, the police are supposed to call when you're hurt or you're struggling. But for a lot of the women that we worked with, they didn't call the police. Like, that's not who they felt comfortable or safe calling, which you know, added to the complexity of domestic violence for Asian and immigrant communities. The other thing that I think, like for me personally, I think the sense I've had an Asian American, the question that a lot of Asian Americans get is, where are you from? And then if you answer, like, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, so I'd say, I'm from Columbus, Ohio. Then the follow-up question is, no, where are you really from? And, you know, most people that ask me that, I don't think ask me that to, like, be harmful to me. But what's always implicit in that question is, you don't belong, right? You must be from somewhere else.
You are other.
There's no way you could be from here. Like, so if I say I'm from Columbus, oh no, that doesn't make sense, you know? Like, you must be from somewhere else. And so the sense I always had growing up was that I was a perpetual foreigner, that I couldn't be from here. So even though I've lived here since I was 7 years old, and English is my more dominant language, I've lived here culturally, you know, almost all of my life, implicitly or explicitly, the message was always, you don't quite belong. And that was a very prevailing memory that I have growing up of being Asian American in this country.
I have a friend who is Korean, but she was adopted as a baby into a family where her parents are Scandinavian and German. And so I talked with her in preparation for our conversation. And one of the things that she said that really, really struck me is that she has this sense that she doesn't belong anywhere. And she said, even though, you know, her parents are very intentional, they sent her to culture camps so that she would know, you know, her Korean heritage, and they were very sensitive about that. When she's operating with other people, you know, she says, my identity is kind of,
because the message you're getting from the community is, you don't belong. Right?
You're other.
You're other, right? And especially as an adoptee, as a Korean adoptee, I'm sure you feel that also, she may feel that within her own Korean community as well.
Yes, that's right, So I was really struck. She was very generous in talking to me about, you know, what her life had been like. But she also talked about her fear now, because she and her husband is white, but they have a little girl who looks more like her mother to me than she looks like her father, and so she has a lot of Asian features. And she says now her concern is like with African American people about their children. She said, I'm afraid for my daughter to be out. You know, she's too young to be out by herself now, but to be out alone, the same thing you were talking about with the older people. She said, I'm concerned about what will happen to her out there by herself. And it's definitely something, you know, that we talk to our children about.
I want to go back to something you mentioned before about sexism being a prevailing part of every racial experience. And one of the things we saw with the shooter in Atlanta was that he targeted Asian women specifically. So I wanted to, kind of get your thoughts about the link between racism and sexism. I know, one of the things we both observed was that Asian women and Black women are kind of hypersexualized, a little bit in different ways, but sexualized. Right. And so there's this link between how racism and sexism are playing out. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's really very interesting. And when you read the stories, about the women who were killed in Atlanta, and you see how you see first of all a counter to that the model minority thing, because you have these women who are struggling economically.
Right. So working class women, right?
The jobs that are available to them, are not ones that put them in a good economic situation. But of course you can forget about them because you're going to talk about these over here, who are doing well and so forth and so on. So that's one way in which you see it, but you also see it in the attitude of men. Mostly, I don't want to make a generalization of all men, because I don't mean that. But in that particular situation, this person talks about trying to resist sexual urges, and he sees those sexual urges being fostered by these people who make, they don't have anything really to do with what's going on in his head. And so the idea is that they should be fulfilling my needs, because they are who they are, okay? And therefore, if I can get rid of them, then that'll take care of whatever the craziness is going on inside of me as a person. Right. And then on the other hand, you have this over-sexualization of African American women. That somehow, we are more interested in sex or whatever it may be. You see that same kind of sexism in differentiating between who Black men are sexually versus who white men are sexually. So at the basis of so much of what we see is this sexism that is there. And so we can use women, okay, for our sexual needs, because we are higher on the totem pole than they are. So you even can get that. Some white women will tell you that they feel some of that as well. But it's very pronounced and mixed in terms of what the attitudes are and how people are actually treated, even in public, and it being okay.
We want to think of like racism is over here and sexism is over here, but the reality is that they are very much interwoven, and to not talk about one with the other doesn't really quite unpack what the complexity of the issue. Absolutely,
So when we are looking at the issues around that, how can we overcome and resist this dynamic that functions in racism to pit communities of color against each other?
Well, it's such an important question. I was thinking about when we were talking about communities being pitted against each other, about 20 years ago we had the LA riots, the LA civil unrest, which happened after a Black man, Rodney King, was beaten within an inch of his life by 4 white police officers, and then the police officers were later acquitted of any wrongdoing, and it caused this massive civil unrest. And I remember, I was 13 years old when that event happened, if that will kind of date me a little bit. And I remember thinking that what we saw, the images that we saw on TV were African Americans and Koreatown store owners, what the TV called, were having race wars, were fighting with each other. And I remember thinking, I don't understand why the Koreans and blacks are fighting with each other, when it was the white police officers that beat up an African American man. And to me, that was the worst case scenario of communities being pitted against each other. A lot of Korean community, what they kind of will tell you was that the police officers, after this verdict came out, rediverted and protected the wealthier white communities, Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, but Koreatown was kind of left on its own, and that K-Town residents, when they called for police help, they didn't receive it. And so to me, here's the worst case scenario of what happens when communities are pitted against each other. These were two poor communities in South Central LA trying to survive. And after this, let's be honest, there was a lot of tension between Koreans and African Americans in that community as well. One of the things that happened before the LA riots was the death of Latasha Harlins, who was a 15-year-old black girl who was killed by a Korean store owner in the months leading up to the LA riots. And so there was real tension between the Koreans and the blacks that was real and present, that is important to talk about. But what we also saw was in light of this terrible police brutality, that it was the Koreans and the blacks who were having a race war. And that has always really, I just remember thinking that as a 13-year-old, there's something wrong here. That's not how we should be responding to this. And my hope is that communities of color can find ways to work and encourage one another. One of the things I was thinking about was even the term Asian American or Asian American Pacific Islander. It's actually a term that was birthed in response to resist against racism. That Asian Americans generally are not considered a very monolithic group. Like I said, it's 48 countries, so there's no natural affinity toward one another. But it was actually out of the civil rights movement, when the Black Power movement was growing, that Asian Americans started to realize that even though we're so diverse, when we come to the US, racism sees no difference between ethnicities. And then around the same time, there was some high-profile deaths. Vincent Chin is one of them. He was a Chinese-American man in Detroit who was killed by two white men who thought he was Japanese, and they were upset about Japanese car industry taking over the American car industry, and brutally killed him. So it didn't matter that Chin was Chinese. When he came to the U.S., he was just Asian, right? And so in the way that the Asian American and Pacific Islander community has been able to come together to say, hey, it is important for us to come together and to name that we need to come together to respond to this. My hope is that we as communities of color can do the same. And my hope is that the church can be a place where that can really happen. Because here in the church, we have, I think, the ability to name what binds us together, right? That we have the imprint of God's image in each of us, and that when I meet you, the first thing I need to see is God's image in you. And if we can kind of lead with that, could that be a way for us to start finding ways to heal together?
But one of the things that I think that is a factor in which we're talking about, particularly around Rodney King, is that first of all, that's a diversionary tactic. You see, so instead of the emphasis being on what was happening to this black person at the hands of a white person, let's look at this thing going on between Koreans and African Americans.
And that's exactly what happens with the model minority myth, right?
That's
and
right.
You don't have responsibility for racism anymore. Because they're gonna deal with it.
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And so then what you I love the dynamic that you get, because it is that there is just so much, right? And so we don't want you to have this over here.
Yeah.
You all fight over this over here.
Yeah.
And so by saying that this group is better than this group among the minority group, then it can create that kind of animosity.
Yeah.
You know, look, they're treated better. They're
Right.
higher regard, you know, and
Right.
so the discomfort gets deflected
Yeah.
onto another minority group,
Right.
instead of saying,
Right.
it's these guys over here, you know, that we need to
lose sight of the root
that's
issue.
right, the real issue that's going on. That they've decided that they're on top and we're not on top, and therefore you all squabble over the crumbs, as you said when we first started out. And so all of that kind of thing is playing into this.
Yeah. Right.
Wonder what it is about human nature
I know.
that has to have this hierarchical kind of way of looking at each other.
Yeah. Right.
You know, I was saying to my students in my preaching class the other day, because they're training to be leaders in the church,
Yeah.
the pastor, the preacher. Can you have church? Do you want to have a church that doesn't have a custodian? Okay. Do you want to have a church that doesn't have, you know, a good musician or good musicians, you know? And I kind of ran down, you know, some of the kinds of things that that very often people. I said, so I used to tell my congregation, you can have church without me, but I can't have church without you. You know, so so I was traveling from Washington to church, and I would say to them, if I don't show up, you all know what to do.
Right.
Because coming across the 14th Street Bridge is not a new problem.
Right.
It's a problem that's existed for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I think the church has contributed by having this kind of hierarchical kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, the pastor's the most important person in the church. Yeah, pastor's real important.
Yeah.
But the pastor can't have church without the rest of the.
Right. The pastor is not the church.
That's right.
Right.
The pastor's not the church.
Yeah.
And all of the different things. I said, do you want to have, nobody knows how to cook
Yeah.
in your church, you know? You know, I just sort of ran down the whole kind of list of things like that. Everybody has to bring their gifts.
Yeah.
And all of us, all of the cultures bring something that can be very empowering to all the rest of us.
Right.
Well, so what do you think is the challenge? You talked a little bit about that to us as Christians.
Yeah.
You know, in the midst of the very open and explicit evidence that that there are people who are being unjustly treated and attacked and demeaned and hurt and killed because they are not like some other group of people.
Yeah.
What's the challenge for us as Christians?
Well, you know, I've thought about this quite a bit, you know, I mean in the last week, but also over the last year. And, you know, one of my, what I've realized is that this is not just a one-time issue. This is a long-term commitment of our faith journey, right? Like I think there's a tendency to think we're responding to the crisis. We're going to do this program and this program and this program and we're done, right? And the racism is solved. That would be so nice if that was the issue, right? But we have long learned that this is a long-term commitment, and in some ways, this is our faith journey. This is the calling that we have been called to. And it also means that we have to be willing to make a long-term commitment to continue to do the hard work of asking these questions and willing to do our own learning and study, willing to work with people who are different than us, learning the theological language and tenets behind it, working within our community. One of the things I've been thinking about is what's right here in our community, you know, and just a mile down from the church, so literally down the street is in Orlandria. There's a little neighborhood that's kind of been nicknamed Chirilagua, and Chirilagua is a name of a small town in El Salvador, and there was a lot of refugees that had come from there in the 80s after the Civil War, and because of so many of the migrants had come, that neighborhood had been nicknamed Little Chirilagua.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done some work with an organization there called Casa Chirilagua that works with the communities there. I thought about like, how do we learn who's right here in our community, right? This is one of the reasons we have this long-term relationship with Rising Hope.
Mm-hmm.
Rising Hope is a mission church down on Route 1. We've worked with them for many, many years. But it means that we have to be willing to make these long-term commitments. This isn't just done with one food drive. It's a commitment that we make that's part of our baptismal vows that we continue to journey with. That when we face frustrations and moments of discouragement, that this is the long faith journey that we've signed up for. How about for you? How do you experience this as a person of faith? How is that part of our call?
Well, I think that one of the things that has happened is that scripture has been used inappropriately to contribute to this hierarchical way of looking at people.
Yeah.
And also of taking things in the Bible and using them to justify. So I think that's one thing. And so I think that we need to pay a lot more attention to what the Bible really says. And we also need to look at the histories of our faith communities so that we can see how our faith communities have contributed to this. You know, there are a lot of people who treat African Americans like they are guests as Methodists. But when the first baptisms occurred, it was an African American woman was baptized with the white people to start the church. But people don't know that history. And so, you know, that is another way of looking at it. But I think the basic thing is that people have decided that God is a God of uniformity, when it is very clear that that's not the case. That is, all we have to do is look at nature. We don't even have to look at the people in nature. But I mean, you know, look at the diversity in the flowers and the trees and the different grasses, the different grains and the different animals and so forth and so on. God is clearly a God of diversity. And we do not value diversity. What we want is sameness. So it's okay, you know, for an African American person to come into the church, but act like a white person. Don't act like, you know, don't be yourself. It's okay for a Korean to be the pastor, but don't bring that Korean stuff in here. You know, we don't want to hear that accent. You know, we want act like a white person, and this is a denial of who God is and who God has created us to be. Are you trying to say that God made a mistake when we have all these people who look different from each other? Actually, it's a real blessing, because we can tell each other apart. You know, that's very helpful. You know, that when I go into my classroom, I see a whole bunch of people that don't look like each other. And so I can tell them apart and I get their names straight, you know, and so forth and so on. And everybody has something to contribute. We need to value and use that diversity. Not squash it, not demean it, but use it, elevate it, celebrate it, and value it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think sometimes when we say that we are created in the image of God, the problem has been that sometimes we think the image of God looks a certain color or looks a certain gender.
Yes.
So when we say we are created in the image of God, we assign human attributes to what that image is supposed to be. And that's not at all what the image of God was. There is no particular race or gender with God.
Yeah.
But that is what makes us intrinsically valuable, right? So when, one of the things I talked about in our children's time today was that when we meet another person, the first thing that we should know is that that person was created in the image of God. And how does that change the way we interact with them and that we love them? And that image of God has nothing to do with skin color or hair color, whether you wear glasses or earrings or whatever, right?
You're short or you're tall or whatever.
That's not what the image of God is. The other things are what make us unique and make us, that captures the beauty of who we are. But that is, one of the ways that we connect to each other as well as through that image of God.
Yeah.
I will say one of the things I'm grateful for the church for, I was thinking about this as we're having this conversation, is I do think the church can be a place, I think it's one of the few places where we can have a chance at redemption, of making this right. I mean, we're in the season of Easter, which is a season of life that came after death. And so it makes me hopeful for the church. I also think, gosh, that I can sit here, a Korean American woman, with you, an African American woman, and have this conversation. This happens because of the church. And I'm grateful for that. That makes me incredibly hopeful for further conversations like this.
Even though the church is doing it very imperfectly in so many ways.
Right.
Yeah, but and so many of the deeper relationships that I have with people from other cultures have been out of the fact that we share the fact that we are Christians. I have relationships that were not connected through the church, but particularly, but those people are Christians too. And so we are open to each other in ways that perhaps we would not be if we weren't. And so, then we have this whole other issue of people being in different religious groups or expressing their faith in God in different kinds of ways. And that, let's separate about that too, It's just a very, very harmful way of seeing that here is God. And fit into this box that I say is like God, and the box is too small.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Youtha, for taking some time for us to have this conversation. I imagine it's not the last time we're going to have this conversation, and there'll be ones that continue.
Well, I've enjoyed this one and the last one too.
As a way of closing, we are going to invite our congregation to say this congregational prayer. And I wondered, this is a prayer that you had wanted to bring, and if you wanted to introduce it and then lead us in that prayer.
Well, I'm familiar with it because I use this part of my devotional life. Dr. Larry Stuckey, who was a worship and preaching professor, who created a book, The Wesleyan Way of Prayer, and it's in there, and I've always loved it. And so that was and I use it regularly in my morning devotions. Shall we pray together?
Let's pray,
Okay. Let us pray. Almighty, justice-loving God, who has created us in your own image, grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil, to make no peace with oppression, that we may reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of your holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen. So what does Chris think?